Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar participants and our Facebook live stream viewers. My name is Sylvie Thrushmarsh. I'm the Head of Advisory for MyHR, and our session today is on suspending employees from work, what that means, when to use it, what it looks like, and some of the consequences that can arise when we do get it wrong. So a little bit of housekeeping before we start. This session will be recorded, so if you miss something, if you have to take an urgent call, if you have any issues with the audio or with the visual, it will be posted on our YouTube channel, and we share it around through our social media later on as well. So you will have a chance to watch it back and to pick up anything that you missed. So with that in mind, if you are asking questions or if you are participating in the discussion, remember to keep your questions anonymized. I will use your first name, but make sure that you don't use any identifying details because this will be accessible to people after the fact. If you do have questions, whether about the content that we talk about today or a situation that you have dealt with and would like to bounce some ideas around, if you're watching on the Facebook Live, just add them as a comment under the video. If you're watching on the webinar, there should be a chat function either at the bottom of your screen or to the right of your screen. I can't work out which way that would be, and I'll pick up your questions at the end. Having audience participation really makes these sessions come alive, so it's not just a talking head talking to a screen the whole time. So you're very, very welcome to send them through and we can incorporate that as part of our discussion today. So that was all the housekeeping. Let's jump straight into our content today, which is about suspension. So employees who are permanent employees of yours, so we're not talking about contractors or temps, have the right to attend work, and you must provide them with work to come and do. That's kind of the baseline that we're starting from. If you want to instruct them not to come to work, there are a few very, very narrow circumstances that you can do that in. And suspension is a particular tool related to what is typically poor behaviour, poor conduct, or a health and safety issue with this particular employee that you're trying to manage. So it's not something you can pull out when you're sick of someone because they've been a dick all day and you just want to get rid of them for the afternoon. It's not a tool to pull out if you are working in retail or hospitality and you don't have enough hours for that person. Suspension is not the tool to use in those circumstances. When it is appropriate is when there is one of two things. So either there is a conduct or behavioural issue that is so severe that you cannot have the employee in the workplace while you're managing the fallout. This might be something like if you have come across evidence or things that make you concerned that your employee is committing fraud, you can certainly run a suspension process to remove them from work and from their accesses to your systems while you investigate. If it was something like a bullying claim or a sexual harassment claim against a particular employee, suspension is likely to be appropriate so that you can remove them as the alleged antagonist from a situation so that you can investigate and manage it with the rest of your team. The second scenario where suspension is likely to be appropriate is where there is a health and safety issue or to themselves or to others at work. So where you have someone who is intoxicated or under the influence of drugs or other substances at work, you can consider suspension then. Where they are engaging in other behaviour that's risky and presents a clear area of concern from a health and safety point of view, that would potentially come under the heading of suspension as well. So just a quick recap, it's not a tool to use when you're just a bit sick of them that day, or that week or that month. It's not a tool to use when you don't have the hours of work to give them for whatever reason, a job's been cancelled or you haven't had as many customers through the door as you might expect. But it is appropriate to use where, one, there is an issue that you are removing them from the workplace to manage because the issue relates to their behaviour or their conduct at work. And the second is to remove them from the workplace where there is a health and safety issue that you are managing, which they present to themselves or when they present to other people. So that's when suspension can be used. To go into more detail, suspension is basically removing someone from the workplace for a period of time. You haven't ended their employment, you haven't fired them, they're not on annual leave, they're not on sick leave. You have made the decision that it is best for the business right now for them not to be there, and it would fall into one of those categories above. So the reason suspension is such a tool to be used in really narrow circumstances is that, like getting suspended from school when we were all a bit younger, many years ago, suspension carries with it a certain amount of stigma or a certain amount of notoriety, I guess. So in the courts and the judges in New Zealand say, in order to outweigh the stigma of being suspended from work and told not to be there for a certain period of time, there must be a really good reason on the employer's side, which outweighs the damage reputationally and psychologically and socially to the employee, which is why we're really particular about the circumstances that can be used. The process for managing a suspension is quite prescribed, which will be no surprise to any of you who've done any work with HR or done any work with me and the team before. It's really important, and I can't stress this key point enough, that if you are considering suspending an employee from work, that you propose the suspension to them and they get 10 or 15 minutes to think about it, give you their feedback, and then you can make a decision. Okay, so if you were to see one of your team lose their rag at a customer, call them all kinds of swear words, and just completely fall them out, basically, you cannot walk up to them and just tell them to go home. You run the risk of legal consequences and penalties, which we'll talk about a bit later in the session. So where there is either I guess what I would call an acute issue or a one-off issue that's causing you concern, that could be swearing at a customer, it could be punching a colleague, it could be any of those kind of immediate things that you need to react to on the spot. Our recommended process is that you take them aside into a private room, you explain why you think proposing them makes sense, you propose the suspension. You say, I'm proposing suspending you from work while we can sort this issue out, and I will make contact with you kind of once I've dealt with the consequences of you punching or swearing or whatever the situation is. And you then leave the room and they get 10 or 15 minutes to have a think about it, give you their feedback, which is likely to be, this sucks and I don't agree with it and you're being a real asshole, which is fine, they can say that. And then having had that feedback, you then consider it and go, okay, I understand that you think this is not fair and doesn't reflect what's happened. Having considered that, I'm deciding to suspend you from work. I'm going to walk you back to your desk or to your cubby or to your office to collect your stuff, and I'll walk you out of the building. So that process is critically important. And again, it's the key piece is to make sure you propose it. You don't have to use super hardcore HR language. You're welcome to, we can give it to you. But the really important thing is that you propose to the employee that they are suspended from work and that they are removed from the premises for the foreseeable future while you navigate what's happened. The question we often get asked by employers is, what if this person disagrees and doesn't want to leave? And that's okay. You don't have to get their agreement to be suspended. You never would be able to if that was the threshold. What's really critical is that you propose it to them and then genuinely consider their feedback. So if you've done that, you've done the right thing. Again, doesn't matter if you've used real specific HR language or not. As long as they've had a chance to comment on it, you've ticked that box, basically. And the reason that step in the process is so critical comes back to what I was saying earlier around suspension being considered quite a serious step to take and quite a, not a punitive measure, but certainly one that indicates something serious is afoot. And because humans tend to think along the lines of where there's smoke, there's fire, you need to have a really good reason and to follow a fair process in order to justify what is likely to be the blowback on this employee. That process is really important. The other question we get a lot of the time is whether employees are paid while they're on suspension. So this comes down to what's in your employment agreement, and we recommend that suspension is paid. Now, in the employment agreement, you can say that suspension won't be paid. The reason we advise it is paid is because the employee at this point hasn't formally been, to use criminal language, charged with or found guilty of anything, right? There's an issue which is of concern, which might be you seeing them punch someone with your own eyes, which is frustrating to have to follow this process if that's the case. But if you have had a complaint about their behaviour, whether it's bullying, whether you've looked at your accounting records and something doesn't quite add up there, whether you have had some really serious concerns from a customer, you have to go through a fair and proper investigation process so that you can make a fair and reasonable decision about what's likely to have happened. And until you've made the what is likely to have happened decision, this employee is still an employee of yours. They still have all the same rights and obligations as they normally would. And our advice to pay while they're on suspension does a couple of things. One, it really, really clearly shows that you haven't predetermined the outcome of this investigation, because you can say, I was paying them, I hadn't made a decision. I knew that we hadn't reached an outcome here yet. The second thing it does, to be honest, is also makes it easier to suspend people. In my experience, when employees learn that they are going to be paid while they're away from work, it's a lot easier to get it over the line with them than if you're having to front concerns about not being able to pay rent or not being able to pay bills and making sure they've got food on the table and so on. So it can feel really frustrating. And I know from experience that the last thing you want to do with someone who's being awful in your workplace is to pay them to have some nice time away from work. So I totally understand that that's frustrating. In terms of a short-term outcome to make it easier to get them out of the business so you can manage whatever's going on, it's really helpful. And in the long term, if they are someone who's likely to get a lawyer or an advocate involved, or who is likely to raise a personal grievance down the line, having paid that suspension will stand you in really good stead. So you're doing future you a favour by paying them while they're on suspension. So that's it in a nutshell. It's a reasonably straightforward process once you get your head around the fact that you can use it in certain circumstances. It's quite prescribed. We recommend paying them, and we recommend just keeping it really, really clean. So I guess some of the situations where I've seen suspension work really well is particularly when the complaints or concerns about their behaviour come from other people in the business. It's often really hard to get a clear sense of whether someone has been bullying, is the common example, when the person who's been bullying you or allegedly bullying you is 2 offices down, or is on the production line 2 over, or you still have to cross paths with. So in terms of giving the rest of your team a really safe space to front and talk about what is happening, it works really, really well to remove the obvious threat from the workplace. Other circumstances where it's worked well is where you just need a bit of headspace yourself to go through an investigation, and particularly when it's things like fraud or sharing confidential information or any of that kind of stuff. Not having this person around, being able to fiddle with records or cause problems or delete emails or that kind of thing, means that you can go through and more accurately decide what has happened and whether there's been any wrongdoing. Situations where suspension hasn't worked well is where managers that I've worked with have felt incredibly strongly about getting this person out of the workplace, but that feeling usually comes from months and months of frustrations with someone, and it kind of boils over in a situation where the employee probably has messed up or has done something a bit shitty, but it doesn't meet that threshold of you being justified in removing them because of the threat they present or because of the situation you're managing. So where managers just haven't had it up to here with someone isn't the only thing you need to consider when you are suspending someone. If your frustration comes from potentially years of this person just being a massive asshole, that's hard to deal with, and it's a lot of emotional management you're having to do of yourself in that situation. But it's not enough to rely on to suspend someone. So that's where I've seen it work well and not work that well, with some examples. We've hit the 15-minute mark, which is great. So we've had a good talk about the content of what I wanted to cover today. This is where I'd be keen to open up the floor to questions, because lots of people have dealt with removing employees from workplaces and so on. So what I will do is jump into my Q&As on the webinar that I'm running. And once I've gone through those questions, I'll then jump onto the Facebook Live. So if there is something that I've said that strikes you as a bit odd or something that you want to check, take a minute now just to go through and put your question through and have a think about it, and I'll come to you shortly. So I've got a question here saying, hi, what if the employee refuses to leave the workplace? That's a really good question. It doesn't happen that often, but it does come up sometimes. So the first thing to say is that if you're dealing with an emotionally volatile situation or an emotionally kind of hit up person, you shouldn't do anything that would put yourself or other people on site in danger. So by no means go and arm wrestle someone who outweighs you by 30 kilos to try and get them out of the building. That's dangerous behaviour for yourself and for other people, and certainly will reflect really badly on you if this does get investigated or taken further later on. So there can be people who refuse to leave by their physical actions. So they sit in a chair, cross their arms and do nothing. Because you've met with them privately, because you're a sensible manager and knew this needed to be done privately, you can leave them in the room and just instruct them not to come back tomorrow. They may choose to stay there with their arms crossed, just being a pain in the ass. It is more likely that they will get up and leave once they realise that they're not welcome back on site or back into the office. People who refuse to leave with their words and kind of keep arguing the point and keep pushing to stay on site, you just need to out-talk them and outweight them, basically. So the feedback is, depending on what they're coming at you with, this won't work for all situations, of course, but it's usually along the lines of, I understand that you disagree. I don't need to get your agreement to suspend you. We will be following up with a letter so that we can put our concerns in front of you and give you a chance to respond, because that's a fair disciplinary process for a fair employer. So you now need to leave. And they'll keep coming at you because they don't want to leave or they want to keep arguing. And the line, you just need to hold the line. It's like if not everyone here will have children, but if you have nieces or cousins, or if you have children yourself, managing the line to go, I know you don't want to go to bed, you just have to, and you don't get a say in it, and this is how things are going to manage going forward. So holding the line is really important. Ultimately, if people refuse to leave and you've given them some time to cool down and you're managing it appropriately, you can trespass them from the workplace. But that's a pretty serious step to take, and I'd really recommend getting some expert employment relations or HR support before you do that. Often there are other pathways to getting them to understand that suspension is important for their protection as well as for your own, and it doesn't always need to come to that. Okay. An anonymous attendee has said, can you move someone straight into a final warning without previous warnings beforehand? So the short answer is you can, but it's in limited circumstances. So if you have someone who is, what's the quickest way to answer this? You can only do so where it's a serious misconduct issue, and going straight to a final warning is appropriate given the circumstances. So what I mean by that is the law is really clear that if it's a lower level behavioural issue, like repeatedly being late, being a bit rude at times, anything that kind of falls into that category, you need to give them a series of warnings before you can dismiss them. And a series of warnings usually means a formal written warning, a final written warning, and then dismissal. So they get a fair chance to improve their behaviour before their employment is terminated. Jumping straight to a final written warning indicates that something quite serious has happened, and we usually see final written warnings be the outcome in disciplinaries in situations where there haven't been, previous warnings, where actually the proposed outcome was dismissal for serious misconduct without any notice period, and for whatever reason the employers decided that I can't demonstrate that this was so bad that I need to fire you immediately, but it's bad enough that I'm going to take it to a final written warning. So you can go straight from nothing to final written warnings. You can't do it for minor issues. It has to be for usually a serious misconduct issue, and it has to be proportionate to the situation that you're trying to manage. So repeated latenesses wouldn't count. Failing to follow instructions some of the time wouldn't count. Not wearing your uniform to work, even though you've been told before, wouldn't count. So in none of those circumstances could you go straight to a final written warning. It would be those series of warnings first. So that was our questions from the webinar. I'm going to do my very best to flip over to Facebook and just check to see if there are any questions here. And I will jump in and have a look. Excuse me. Cool. It doesn't look like there has been any questions on the Facebook Live video, which is great. Hopefully those people will post some questions afterwards and I can pick up. So if there are no more questions or no one else has anything they want to understand, we will wrap it up and leave it there. So again, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real treat to see that people are paying attention and that we do have people attending the webinar. So thank you very much for giving us your time. If you do have any questions after the webinar, you're welcome to jump over to Facebook and pop your questions up on the live video there. Otherwise, please email help@myhrworks. Again, that's help, HELP, @myhr.works, WORKS, and myself or the team will come back to you. Again, this webinar will be live on our social media channels, so YouTube, Facebook and LinkedIn will post it around, so you're welcome to catch it afterwards. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, whatever that involves. So thank you so very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one.